Welcome to Leadership Where It Matters Most. The family is the most important institution in the world. The future of the church passes through the family. The church has the greatest mission of any organization ever. Go and make disciples of all nations. The family and the church. This is where leadership matters most. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to Leadership Where It Matters Most. Before I get into this week's episode, can I just encourage you to both subscribe and to write a review? I don't know how all this works, but they tell me, who they is, I'm not sure, but good friends. They tell me that writing a review actually helps this podcast get out to the world. The algorithms work that way. So please write a review, please subscribe and send it out and encourage others to do the same. We've got a great episode today. My guest is Monsignor James Shea. Monsignor is the president of the University of Mary. He was actually named president back in 2009 when he was only 34 years old, which at the time made him the youngest president, I think, in North America. Monsignor Shea is a prairie guy. He grew up on a dairy farm in North Dakota. I have similar roots because I grew up in the prairies in Canada, in Saskatchewan, in Saskatoon. Now, Monsignor, the reason why we were talking is because Monsignor is one of the authors of From Christendom to Apostolic Mission. And if you follow me at all, you know how much I appreciate this book and have been promoting its wisdom for quite some time, ever since it was released in 2020, I believe. The subtitle is Pastoral Strategies for an Apostolic Age. And one of the things that we actually talked about in this episode is that I noted to Monsignor, and he kind of recognized this with tongue in cheek, that, he didn't write a book that was subtitled, 5 Steps to Become an Apostolic Institution. This is not a book of tactics. It is a book to shape our mindset, to develop an apostolicity of our mind, a right paradigm, a way of thinking. And that's one of the reasons why I really appreciate it, because as Stephen Covey says, if you want to change a little bit, focus on behavior. But if you want to make quantum leap change, then develop a new way of thinking. And this book really does provide wisdom and insight to help us develop a new way of thinking, an apostolic way of thinking. So this conversation covers a lot of ground. We talk about how the book came to be, because it was really born out of the Fellowship of the Burning Heart. It was Monsignor and a small group of friends that got together and prayed about these things and spoke about in conversation and debate and dialogue. And then a final kind of manuscript was on him. It was his responsibility. And he tells a story about how they didn't really know how this would sell and all the rest of it. It's kind of funny, and he gets into that a little bit. But we talk a lot of the themes of the book that pop, at least for me. We talk about certainly the battle right now in contemporary culture over a proper understanding of anthropology, just the dignity of the human person. Talk about the role of the family, the missionary dimension of the family. So it was just a great conversation. It was one that I was really waiting for. Was so grateful to have it with Monsignor that he made some time for me to record. And I hope to be able to get a time to record again, because he just released a new book called The Religion of the Day, which I'm about halfway through. He mentions some of the ideas in that book in this podcast episode, but he doesn't get too much into it. So maybe I'll be able to have him on again. That would be a real delight. So there you go. Monsignor Shea, enjoy the episode. Monsignor James Shea, it is wonderful to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for doing this.
It's a joy to be here with you, Brad. Thanks for all that you do.
God is good. I really want to jump in and talk a lot about the book, From Christendom to Apostolic Mission, partly because of its huge impact on me, in many ways, on my family, on my ministry, and on so many people locally and elsewhere that I know that have been really, really gripped by the wisdom and the message of this book. But I want to, for those listeners who don't know, and I've heard you tell this story a couple of times, I think it would be good to know how this book really came to be, because it was born out of a Fellowship of the Burning Heart. It's not a singular authored book. It's really a group of friends that got together. Can you tell us how this came to be?
Yeah, so it's a bit of an embarrassing story, to tell you the truth. I'm happy to tell it to you because mostly I myself am the one being embarrassed by it. So, I've been very blessed. As happens in the Christian life, the Lord asks a lot of us in order to be his disciples. We have to lay down a lot, and that's important. But of course, the joy of following him is doubled and tripled and quadrupled by his own goodness, which is so apparent. And one of the ways in which he blesses us is with the gift of friends. And this is one of
Mm.
my great blessings in life, is that I have good friends who love the church and who think reflectively about the fortunes of the church, about what's happening in the world today and all of those things. And these are colleagues and friends, scholars and other people in administration and leadership in the church. And we had been getting together, having a series of conversations about what was happening and reflecting really upon the teaching all the way from St. John Henry Newman, who saw this starting to happen all the way back in his time, through John the 23rd and Paul the Sixth, who were the popes of the Second Vatican Council and who really, in a very prophetic way, gazed into the modern world and the postmodern world and the need for an energetic response to it. John Paul II, Benedict XVI, Francis today, just being attentive to all of that, we thought, it really is apparent that there's a sea change, that there's a
Mm.
massive shift that's happened, that there's sometimes in history when you can draw a bright line between everything that went before and everything that is coming after, and that we happen to be honored to live in such a time.
Mm.
Such times are perilous, but they're also full of great possibility and the creative energy of the Holy Spirit and of God's movement. And so I think that the essay from Christendom to Apostolic Mission in its origin was an attempt to sketch that out. And really, I think its ultimate origin was just notes for talks that were given. I remember first speaking about this to the Finance Council of the Diocese of Phoenix, Arizona. Bishop Olmsted had me come down to speak with them. And that got me into an administrative mindset, because, of course, if you're talking to a finance council, they're in charge of the allocation of resources. And that touched upon this question, which is taken up in the essay, about how the church needs to steward the resources of the church in an apostolic time as opposed to a Christendom time,
Mm.
and how great strategic errors can be made in that respect. And so this was the back of a napkin. This was
Mm.
frantically typed out notes. This was airplane scribblings and conversations between friends and anecdotes to try and build it out. And then at a certain point, I think that there was a desire to put something more in writing, to do something more systematic with it. And so we put together a manuscript, which went around and around, you know what
Mm.
I mean, with different edits and suggestions and those kinds of things. Now, here's where it gets really embarrassing, Brett, but I'll tell it to you. Then it sat on my desk for 3 years because I just didn't have time to do anything more with it. And at a certain point, I was really bothered by this. I have a conscience, praise God.
That's good to
And
hear.
yeah, and my conscience was troubled, that here was this text and that it was just languishing,
Mm.
but I didn't have the bandwidth, to pull it together and to do sort of the final read through and get it ready for publication. And then the COVID-19 pandemic descended in March of 2020. And like every college campus that I know, the University of Mary emptied out. I think we held on just a little bit longer than most places in the hope that we could get to the end of the academic year, which for us ends at the end of April. And so we thought, gosh, if we could just do 6 weeks,
Mm.
we can make it. Well, we didn't make it. And so then everybody was home. At first, it was very difficult because we were doing the administrative work of, okay, how do we do all this online learning and all that? Then things were very quiet. And for the first time in nearly 15 years, I had a little bit of time on my hands. And I thought,
Mm.
okay, here we go. So I rolled up my sleeves and we put the final touches on it and chose, you've seen the text, chose as the cover image. We thought maybe this is Austin, who you worked with in my office. He's kind
Mm.
of the artistic director of the Galaxy and does amazing work. And he and I were going around and around. We were thinking we needed an image of the first martyrs, like during the Diocletian persecution or something. And then we found this image of the first Christians in Kiev, in what's now
Mm.
Ukraine, and put that on the cover, not knowing that a year following its publication, this huge conflict would break out in Ukraine. So anyway, so we published the book, Brett, and we put it up on Amazon, but that wasn't to sell it. It's just because automatically anything University of Mary Press publishes goes up on Amazon, in an effort to make Jeff Bezos even richer.
Of course.
It just kind of sat there until September. So it came out in May. In September, we were noticing something really was shifting. It had been selling a little bit through the summer in ways that surprised us. By September, it was 150 copies every single day. And then dioceses were ordering thousands of copies of it. And it really touched a nerve. I don't think it's because there's anything creative or groundbreaking in it, but it is a very simple, straightforward, not simplistic, but a straightforward and simple explanation or sketch of the times in which we find ourselves. And the other aspect of it is that we're pretty resolute in avoiding a doom and gloom response to the times in which we live. And so we face stern challenges, but we set out first to encourage ourselves and then to encourage others. But the text in its essence was an attempt to sketch out for the people who work at the University of Mary what it would be like for our small institution on the windswept plains of North Dakota with about 4,000 students, what it would be like for us to make a shift from being a Christendom institution to an institution on Apostolic Mission. It's found resonance beyond our campus. It's an embarrassment a little bit, but also it's a joy and a bewildering honor, I guess.
I mean, I've seen even on a micro scale that level of response locally here in Vancouver and elsewhere because of my connections in Canada. And it just, everybody I talk to is reading this book and has been impacted by this book. There's a line that says that which is most personal is often universal. So as you talk about your own, educational institution at the University of Mary, you're trying to find a playbook, if you will, for your own university. Well, of course, it's going to apply because all of our decade-old institutions are facing the same culture, facing the same realities, the same resources, and all the rest of it. So I'm not surprised at all. But I mean, you were surprised. I think you continue to be surprised, and hopefully Religion of the Day is going to see the same response. But have you gotten more understanding as to why it resonated? One of the thoughts that I had while you collect your own is it's kind of like you have said in written form publicly what a lot of people were thinking and talking about privately in their own offices, in their own places. So it just resonates with so many people saying the same thing, thinking the same way.
Brett, I think that's right. I would nuance that just a little bit, but I think that it touched a nerve because a lot of people were thinking and feeling and discussing the times in which we live. And this did sketch it out. It expressed it in simple black and white. By black and white, I mean in print, not like either or. But I think that the other aspect of it is that I think that a lot of the consideration, the thinking and feeling and discussing was not resolved toward a hopeful vision either. And so I think people have just been really afraid and even angry and feeling like the whole world was falling apart and clutching their hands together and not knowing quite what to do. It's a relief, I think, and I experienced this not because the University of Mary was a source for the dissemination of this, but I myself experience it as a relief when I take stock of the times in which we live and then turn to the enduring, perennial, conquering spirit of the gospel and put those things into concourse with each other. And so I think it's right that the diagnostic, which again is not original, the popes have been saying this, but evidently no one listens much to popes because of encyclicals and all of that. And so this was a very accessible way to express it. But the diagnostic, I think, resonated with people. But in addition to that, it wasn't cast in a grouchy or ideological fashion.
Yeah.
That's just not who we are in North Dakota or probably in Canada.
We're very polite.
Yeah. We're not doomsday purveyors. And so I think that that's probably it. I think it tapped into how people were thinking and feeling, things that they were talking about, expressed it with a kind of simplicity that people could build upon given their own expertise and thoughts, and then put it into the light of the gospel, which means that the world is not falling apart and God is still the king and knows what he's doing and is not anxious, and neither should we be.
Yeah. I want to share, this just came to mind, Monsignor. I want to share an experience with you and get your thoughts in light of especially that kind of positive vision that you want to portray in these times. And part of the reason why I want to share this is because I'm a people watcher. So I don't just hear what you're saying, but I watch. And quite often when I've heard you speak, you'll mention the phrase, in the times in which we live or in the times as such as these. And I see you almost take a bit of a pause and a deep breath. Now, fast forward or shift a little bit. I had a call come into my office. This was, I don't know, maybe it was 2 years ago now. And I didn't recognize the phone number, which means it was a direct line. So somebody had my direct line, which is not uncommon. And on the other end of the line, when I said, "Good afternoon, Brett Powell," he said, "Good afternoon, Brett. This is Bishop so-and-so." I won't say his name, but immediately I knew him and knew of him. And just salt of the earth, good man. No one would have anything, nasty to say about him. Just salt of the earth. So I was surprised, and I just said, "Well, what can I do for you? I don't even know what you say to a bishop when he calls you like that." And he said, "Well, Brett, I talked to 3 different bishops, and each of them said I should phone you," which is flattering for about 2 seconds. And then you realize, oh boy, we're talking about something very serious here. And so I said, "Well, Bishop, by all means, thank you. How can I help?" And then he went on to describe the state of his diocese in a way that I think most bishops in the West, particularly in North America, would be able to describe. Vocations, money, problems with clergy, lack of vision, just all of it, right? The long litany. And as I'm listening to this, I can just feel this sense of darkness, that it's not just the problems, but it's a mindset, and I'm not faulting him. And at the end of his kind of summary, all I could muster was to ask him a question, which was, "Well, Bishop, let me start with a question. What is the Father saying to you in this?" And then I realized that's probably not something you're supposed to ask the bishop. But I was like, it was the only thing I could think of. And all I heard on the other end was, "Well, Brett, it's been hard, And his voice got a little verklempt. And I think of how many people, good people, are in this situation. And it's augmented when we feel alone and isolated and orphaned. And yet how important it is to have that right understanding of who we are as church, who Jesus Christ is as the Lord of the universe and all the rest. Because otherwise you can start grasping for some other modes or utopias, as you like to talk about. But how important is it? And what are the factors that are inhibiting us from stepping into our true identity? Because that's really what's at stake here, is stepping into our true identity as Christians, as fellow believers in the church. What are the obstacles from embracing that proper mindset, that apostolic mindset that we just so desperately need?
Yeah, there's a lot there. This morning at 7:00 a.m., I celebrated the Mass for the presentation of the Lord. So we're taping this on the 2nd of February. How does one preach for this feast? Because it's just, it's a mystery of the Christian faith, which is filled with theological significance, going back to the plagues in Egypt and the command to bring the firstborn to the temple, the promise of the Lord coming to his temple suddenly, filling it with light, purifying it, all of these things. But I was focused, the ancient name for this feast is Ocursus Domini, the encounter of the Lord. And we have, in the freshman women's residence, we have a Cursus Domini chapel, which is a chapel which is filled with images of people encountering the Lord. Simeon encountering the child Jesus, the woman at the well, St. Fatina, Mary Magdalene encountering the risen Christ. In the midst of it all, I remembered, I said, Simeon was waiting for the Lord. And so the Lord was thrilled and joyful to see him, because the Lord is always looking for someone looking for him,
Yes.
And I said the grief in Simeon's heart, because he had been longing and waiting with all of the yearning of his people, all of the yearning of Israel for all of those years, that grief in his heart was relieved, lifted, and transformed by the appearance of Christ in the temple, and God had fulfilled his promise, and now he could go in peace. That's the nunc dimittis. Now, what I said then to the students is something that my spiritual director had said to me. He said, all sin is just unrelated grief. I said, really? And he said, yes, all sin is unrelated grief. In other words, when we have grief, which comes because the bridegroom is not with us, which comes because we're waiting for the Lord and aching and longing for his coming. It comes then in derivative form in all of the sorrows and hardships of our lives and the times in which we live. When we don't relate that to God, when we instead allow it to turn us in upon ourselves and become frustrated or flustered or incapacitated or angry or sullen or resentful, when we allow that grief to mark us in that way, then we're not holding it up to the Lord, who then has the power to transform it by the sweetness and beauty of his presence. And so, when you tell that story of the bishop, or when you note that I do take a breath when I say the times in which we live, I think, the conversation between Frodo and Gandalf, when Frodo says, I wish that none of this had happened. I wish the ring had never been found. I wish it hadn't come to me. And Gandalf says, so do all who live to see such times, but that's not their choice. The choice that we have is how to respond to the times that we've been given. And that's not an unworthy task. In fact, it's a task that we can rally to because we have the spittle for it. And we have the grace for it too. God's given us that. I say to our students at the University of Mary all the time that there's no room for nostalgia in the Christian life, that it's not a Christian thing. One can gaze with admiration upon the things of the past, but not with a kind of possessive longing, because that's not what we were made for. We were made for these times.
When I first started really, encouraging people to pick it up and read and all the rest of it, there wasn't just a few that seemed kind of reticent to the message. And some of those flowed into conversation, so I got a little bit more understanding as to it. But what I saw in some was this resistance to the idea, that very fundamental idea that Christendom is dead, that Christendom no longer exists, because I think they still do equate the church and Christianity with Christendom. And of course, nobody wants to hear that the church is dead, that Christianity is completely irrelevant. But that's not at all what it is. It's just the culture animated by, Christian moral order and all the rest of it. But one of the things that you speak about, not only in the book, but elsewhere, is how important it is for us to understand the battle is really about, it's an anthropological battle. It's understanding the human person. And the refusal to believe in postmodernism about the fall and all that. Like, what else would you want to say about how, as the church needs to rise, it really is presenting a vision of humanity, the human person, in all of its proper place as being made in the image and likeness of God, with that dignity.
Right. So the second book, The Religion of the Day, is an attempt to expand upon the sketch of the progressivist, modernist religion, which is contrasted with the Christian imaginative vision at the end of the first essay, at the end of From Christendom to Apostolic Mission. What we're noting in The Religion of the Day is that we're not living simply in a secular time, as people say, that we're living in a deeply religious time, actually, and that the religion is a derivative form of, or a warped form of Christianity that borrows its epic moral force, but mutates it in a strange way. And so it does become then an anthropological question. In other words, both the religion of the day and the religion or the faith of Christianity acknowledge evil in the world, but located in different places.
Yes.
We believe in the fall. We believe the human race has rebelled and needs to be rescued, and that God has come to rescue us, and that's the good news. The religion of the times in which we live believes also in evil, but locates it external, that there's no need fundamentally for internal reform so much as the throwing off of oppression and the rearrangement of circumstances and a particular kind of education and all of those things. And it does all, in the end, come down to anthropological questions. When Jesus says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free," he means the truth about God and the truth about the human person and the truth about the world in which we live. And all of these things have been altered in the postmodern mind in a way which is almost like an inoculation, because everybody who grew up in a world in which the Christian faith, at least its scent or its appearance still lingers. Lots of people who have been baptized and confirmed and have been raised in the church seriously or unseriously believe that they've heard, or people who pick up the newspaper, they believe they've heard, they know what Christianity is all about. It's not earth-shattering good news. It's passé. It has nothing to offer, and so as a result, they won't even hear it. And so they've never really heard the story. And what we need to do in the times in which we live is awaken them again to hear it again for the first time, to hear it again for the first time, you know? And so, yeah, I think that the question is a question of the human person. There are two competing ideas which have been part of a cultural and spiritual civil war over the course of the last 3 centuries or so, and we've lost a lot of ground. We haven't lost the truth, meaning that ultimately, what the Lord and what reason reveals to us about the human person will persevere, but we have to fight for it now in ways we might not have had to a couple of hundred years ago.
Yeah. I'll read to you something right out of the book from Christendom, Apostolic Mission, and understanding the context here is this kind of opposing views on the human person. But it says, when a culture's vision, you could say in a culture's vision or understanding of the human person, is seriously contested, the society will go into a crisis until its original vision is either reconstituted or overthrown, and another overarching vision takes its place.
Right.
That is an incredible summary of what we're seeing in the culture, particularly around the dignity of the human person. And me being in Canada, frankly, we're about 25 years ahead in watching that battle unfold, I think. You know, when our country has not discussions in the House of Commons, but in Parliament buildings, you know, discussing the possibility of parents, for example, having the right, and some would say the moral obligation, to end their children's life up until 1 year of age when they have undetected birth defects. You think, what is going on? 20 years ago, nobody's having this conversation, and now we're having it officially.
Yeah.
So that's the essence of it. It so often comes down to the understanding of the human person.
Yeah, and I think this relates to your earlier question. I think that this kind of discussion is getting a lot of attention, partly because of the scenario that you just described, where you have formerly Christian countries considering legislation and cultural shifts, undergoing cultural shifts, considering legislation, which would have been simply unthinkable, which would have been run out of the room as completely unacceptable just a generation or two ago. But I want to return just briefly to the unrelated grief. Another reason that it's getting attention and that these ideas land is not simply because we're seeing difficulty in the culture all around us, but because we're losing those we love. I can't tell you how many people, moms and dads, grandmas and grandpas, who have come up to me after I've given some mediocre talk on something and tried to sketch this out. And then they'll say, I'm so grateful because I've been racked with guilt about the fact that my wife and I, we did the same thing that our parents did. My husband and I, we sent our kids to Catholic schools. We taught them their catechism. And our parents did that for us, and we kept the faith. Maybe we left for a little while in college, but then we came back. Whereas our kids, they're gone, and our grandkids aren't even baptized. And so there's a deep grief that surrounds that. And this gives an account of that says, you know what? It's not just your fault. Your parents had an ambient culture to assist them in raising you, whereas you were trying to do it unawares while everything was shifting under your feet. I think, for instance, I grew up in the last gasp of Christendom, about 40
Mm,
miles from the University of Mary's campus on a small farm, 2 miles north of a town of 200. You know what I mean? It might have well as been parts of Saskatchewan or Manitoba. That's North Dakota
yeah,
for your
yeah.
listeners.
Yeah, I grew up in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, so I
Okay,
know
well,
it
there you
well.
go. And so, but when I was growing up, I was the oldest of 8 children, and my parents, my teachers in school, my coaches, the Catholic priest, and the Lutheran minister in town were all in the same team. They were
Mm,
all they were all part of this formative project, and there were kids in town, and they were going to work together on this project and get us ready to live lives of meaning, purpose, and contribution according to the vision of the gospel. My younger brother is raising his family of seven children on the same farm 40 or so years later. It's completely different for him. He and his wife have to be much more intentional than my parents needed to be.
yeah.
They have to be very much more, not careful, but thoughtful about what they're going to do and how they're going to do it, because they can't rely upon anybody else to help them. It's a big change. And so that grief, I think, gets people's attention because they're discontent about it, heartbroken.
Absolutely. I've witnessed that so many times, and it's so difficult to interact with because the pain runs so deep. What's interesting, like even myself raising my own family, our oldest is 27. He's got 2 kids and one
Ah.
on the way.
Wow,
Our
you're a
youngest is
grandpa.
14. I'm a grandpa, believe it or not. Yeah. And my youngest at home is 14. And even the world in which those two have grown up in itself is different.
Yeah,
13 years apart. It is so different, which requires such an intentionality, right? From all of our institutions, the family being the primary institution. And maybe I read it from you, I can't remember, but the missionary dimension of the family, I think, is going to become increasingly more important.
yeah.
That there's this cell of protecting from postmodern crazy, but at the same time, instilling and fostering this missionary impulse capable of transforming everything. Maybe that's one of your lines. I don't know.
I don't know either, but I will tell you just from my own experience, if we can just jump on a bandwagon
Yeah,
together.
yeah.
So I run a serious Catholic university, and we put ourselves out there as being serious, Catholic, and affordable. So we have a lot of students who come to us from the wide world, and I think the family as a missionary endeavor is a really important consideration, not as a retreat. And so you want to provide the proper protection for your kids, so that they're not
Mm-hmm.
simply swept away by the contamination of the world.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you don't want to fill them with fear.
Mm-hmm.
And what I do see, I'm so blessed. I have the best students I can imagine here, but a lot of them, because their parents are fearful about the ambient culture, arrive to us more fearful than they need to be. I think a lot of people think that the University of Murray is going to be a bubble for them, and we're just not that at all. We're not into that. You know what I mean? And I don't want to be that. I want to be a laboratory of the new evangelization. I want it to be a place where students of all backgrounds can mix it up, and where the governing vision of the university as a Catholic institution can provide a leaven for students both to spread their wings and to learn how to fly. So it's an interesting thing in that one has to be really thoughtful to raise a family in that missionary mode, because you want to give them courage and confidence, while at the same time giving them proper caution and prudence,
Mm.
but not fear.
Yeah.
Fear, of course, is just a bad counselor.
No, absolutely. That's really good. Absolutely. And that comes back to, the importance of having the right mindset, right? Like, even when we were raising our kids, obviously the option to homeschool, for example, and this is not a knock on anybody that chooses to homeschool, but one of the reasons why we didn't want to is that going to even a Catholic school, there is an encounter with the world that creates a conversation that's necessary,
Yeah.
because you're going to have it with your kids at some point.
Yeah.
So why not at age appropriate levels, all the while they're growing up? So one of the times, all of our kids are involved in sport, going on to play sport in the university, and it was our oldest who was going on a trip, and we couldn't always go because we have 8 kids and we can't be everywhere. There's just no keeping up.
Yeah.
So we had to be very discerning what families that they go with and all that. And so he went on this trip, and he found himself at a restaurant with his family, and he bowed his head to pray, and he was 14 years old at the time. The mom picked up on it and said, "Jacob, what are you doing?" And then she said, "You're about to pray, aren't you?" And he says, "Yes." And she said, "Well, why don't you pray with the family?" And so he led this family that he was traveling with in grace before a meal.
Beautiful.
But here's the beautiful thing is that the mom shared with my wife after that, that was the first time they prayed, but that she and her husband were the first of their families each to not be baptized.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. And that this little intervention was this incredible encounter with grace and what's possible. And why did I not do this? And this should be important. And all these questions started stirring up. But it's just that idea that there's nothing more missionary, especially in this world, than just witnessing by your life to the true understanding of who you are.
Yeah,
and I give thanks when I'm fed, right? It's very simple.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
Let's shift and talk a little bit more. I don't know if it's pragmatically or not, because one of the things I see when I read from Christendom and Apostolic Mission, you're not presenting the 5 steps that every institution needs to take in order to become apostolic. Right? This is really about a mindset, which is beautiful because I think when you change people's minds, you really can lead to change, whereas behavior is just incremental at best. But what are the obstacles, Monsignor? Because I look at my city of Vancouver, and there are Catholic institutions all over the place.
Yeah.
I look in Canada, there's Catholic institutions all over the place, but we need to make a shift. What are some things that we need to do in our institutions? Because they are being whispered from the culture. You can either have loyalty to your faith and lead to demise, or you can just be a good source of, something positive in society and just kind of truncate yourself from your faith.
Yeah.
What do our decade-old institutions need to do?
Yeah. Well, so it's a tough question in that, and it is one that we've deliberately sidestepped to a certain extent. In other words, in part 4 of the book, we give 8 principles,
yes,
according to which reform and renewal can happen. But we are very careful not to give the 5 steps. And this has been, I think, and I don't know how it is in Canada as much as the United States. The Americans are so pragmatic that this has been a source of enormous frustration, And so I'll be invited to speak to a group of Catholic dentists or Catholic businessmen, and they want to know how to implement this because they're like, we got to go, what's the cash value of all this? Well, I have no idea. I run a university. You know what I mean? In other words, it's a whole different thing. And the other aspect of it is that I just can't think of a time in church history when there's been a formulaic response to a set of circumstances that has been universally successful.
Yeah.
So I think of the renewal, for instance, in 19th century France, after the ravages of the French Revolution and the aftermath of that. And what happened is that there were all kinds of movements that sprung up in the darkness, movements among the laity, among the clergy, within the realm of education, within the realm of religious life and priestly training, and all kinds of, and then devotions that grew up, in various aspects of the French countryside. And it was like a new springtime or a slow flood that filled the valley.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's how renewal happens when the Holy Spirit is present. And so, when I'm looking at the various institutions, I'm hesitant to give in fact, I'm refusing to give a step-by-step process, except to say that within the principles themselves, for instance, being comfortable with a certain amount of apostolic messiness, or thinking about the deployment of resources in a different kind of way, or not being trapped by sociological analysis, which I think is a big difficulty for us in the times in which we're living. All of these things are deeply important to keep in mind, but it is a question of vision. Theodore Roosevelt, who was one of our presidents down here, he spent time in North Dakota, said he never would have been president had it not been for his time in the North Dakota Badlands. But one of his great sayings was, do what you can with what you have where you are. Do what you can with what you have where you are. And so I think that the first step in every renewal is for us ourselves to be more deeply converted to the gospel, and to hold up our whole selves, holding nothing back for ourselves, and allow the penetrating and transforming grace of God to work within us. And within that context of our own conversion and repentance, joyful repentance all the time, every day of our lives, within that, the creative and renewing power of God begins to take hold. And then you're able to think and discuss and pray with other people. My friend, Father John Riccardo, with Acts 29 talks about praying as a physician and praying as a general. You should pray and say, where are we most sick? And then where are the strongholds of the enemy? And those two discernments then give you a way forward, because they show you the contours of the battle and the particular territory which is in danger at any given time. But I just don't have the expertise to be able to provide a blueprint that works in every circumstance, because circumstances really are very different. And I'm sorry if that's unsatisfying, but because you're Canadian and nicer than my American compatriot, you probably won't excoriate me so profoundly or vigorously for dodging that.
Not at all. I figured as much.
I will say this. I can tell you what a person should do at a university in North Dakota with a particular endowment and a particular tuition structure and a particular demographic.
Yeah.
I can do that, but I don't know how applicable that is to everybody. But that was my task. And so I poured myself out into that. And then you can see other remarkable efforts of renewal all over, to include in the Archdiocese of Vancouver. Lots of, parishes in the Archdiocese itself, Catholic education up there, lots of wonderful things happening, huh?
Yeah.
And that's all the result of sort of this creative vision and then a lot of tenacity and trust.
Yeah. It's funny to say that, Monsignor, because one of the things I thought about asking you is if you ever considered and wanted to bring some words around, sort of in a principle way, similar to the other 8 principles, but sort of subsidiarity's place in all this. I've only worked within the institutional church for the last 10 years. And certainly when you do, you run into this reality of subsidiarity and the hundreds of different definitions of what it means, depending on who you talk to. But this idea that really at the local level, we need to pray through these things and be led by the Spirit and commit to what He's saying and guiding us. Like, what a novel concept, right? Yeah. I mean, maybe say something about that, because, there's dioceses that are buying the book. And what if the priests don't want to know the book?
Yeah, of course.
That all of a sudden you create more of the tension that they're already living out.
Yeah.
What does subsidiarity mean in the apostolic mode? Is there any thoughts on that?
I do have a thought. I don't know about the apostolic mode part. I'll attempt that, but I do want to respond. You've got all of these definitions of subsidiarity, which you mentioned, and I am frustrated by that, because it's one of these words that can be morphed into whatever you want it to mean, type of thing. And usually it means leave me alone, or don't give me any guidance, type of thing. Well, of course, that's not how the church works. And the mind is not most free when it's undisturbed by authority, but when it's working in concert with it, in that sense.
Yes.
But I do think that the resistance to a formulaic solution or to a blueprint that can be universally applied is an expression of subsidiarity, because we do want these principles and these ideas to be applied at the local level in the most creative possible way. And then in the midst of that, for us to look to the gospel and to the authority of the church and to our local bishops and to the Holy Father to help us to think these things through and apply them as best as we can. Yeah, I don't know how much more to say about that. Is that helpful? It might not be.
No, it is. I mean, it's a big thing, and I've seen it. Yeah, let's talk about this, because I remember I watched your presentation at Seek talking about the fall and what actually happened and all that.
Oh, yeah.
It's interesting because I think the fall is messing with a lot of the distrust that we see. And I'm not just speaking about myself, my own diocese, because I'm in fact, I'm not actually talking about my own diocese because we're quite healthy in this way, but I've seen elsewhere that like one of the issues of the fall that we carry in is this suspicion to the Father, that the enemy sowed seeds of doubt, that he's holding something back, that he's a jealous God, and all those kinds of ideas. And of course, God the Father is perfect. He never did anything against us, and lived and loved perfectly, and continues to. He is love. And yet we carry this doubt and suspicion, and we project it onto all kinds of authorities, and it's messing things up. And certainly one of the things that's going to have to happen if we're really going to make this shift is that the tension that often defines the relationship between kind of head office, if you will, within a diocesan structure and the field, which is the parishes and the pastors, that has to be healed. That has to be whole. And there has to be a real sense of collaboration and subsidiarity. And I see that that's one of the ways the enemy is perpetuating the impact and the effects of the fall, is this doubt and suspicion against authority.
Yeah, I just want to quote you back to yourself. Earlier in this conversation, you mentioned the orphan spirit. The best talk that's ever been given at Seek certainly wasn't the talk that I gave earlier this year, but it was some years ago. Sister Bethany Madonna of the Sisters of Life gave a talk. I'll never forget this. I was there, as usual, with hundreds of students from the University of Murray. I think we take 5-6 buses down to Seek. I think it was in Chicago. I think it was in Chicago. Anyway, so she's talking about the orphan spirit, that God is not a good God and that we're all alone and that we have to make our way through the world. And I looked around and all of my students were in tears hearing this spoken to them. It is the case that an orphan spirit has been afflicting us and that we need to be delivered from it, because we're not orphans, not within the context of our walk of faith with the Lord, who's a good Father, and not in the church and in the church's ministries and apostolates either. But this is perpetuated in the suspicions that crop up at universities. Of course, it's between the administration and the faculty, or between the faculty and the support staff and the custodians and dietary staff and all of these things. Human beings have an inveterate tendency toward tribalism and competition and division and all of these things, suspicion. And it's all unsettling in that all of that is an attempt to disable and destroy the beauty and the joy of human life, by which we're meant to bring renewal to the face of the earth, to human relationships and to families and schools and parishes and dioceses and universities and all of these communities that we're a part of. In order for that to happen, I do think that we have to reclaim a kind of confidence in the goodness of the Father, and to reject, bad spirits have to be rejected. They can't just be like resisted passively. You have to reject and renounce them. And I do think that that's necessary in the times in which we live.
Good friend of mine, older mentor many years ago when my kids were all young, said, your job is to paint an accurate image of God the Father by the brush of your example.
Wow.
And when you don't, say sorry.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Keep it simple. Just last question, Monsignor, because you spoke about, this orphan spirit and this idea of, doing it alone, and Christianity lived alone, especially in the culture in which we live, I think is just a disaster waiting to happen.
Yeah.
And you opened by talking about how blessed you are to have good friends.
Yeah.
And out of that good friends and that fellowship came this wonderful book. Maybe encourage people that are listening, especially leaders, because it's never the case, but sometimes we leaders think we can go alone. And man, that is a scary place to be, alone with the weight of full responsibility. That's a scary place. But how important do you think it's going to be as we continue to gallop into this kind of evaporating relationship between church and culture, that we really learn to do life together in fellowship?
Yeah. So let me answer that by, you mentioned before this impatience that I've expressed publicly with utopian delusion, the idea of utopianism. And I think that it is a problem from a societal or cultural standpoint. It's a problem organizationally too. I think because we drink the water and breathe the air of utopia, which the modern mind is obsessed with, we come to think that our families And our businesses and our organizations and our parishes are meant to be utopian in their character as well. And this is not at all what they're supposed to be. They're meant to be arenas of human failure and then redemption. They're meant to be places where the Paschal Mystery can be replayed in real time in individual human lives. Father Jacques Philippe, that great spiritual writer, said that modern man is condemned to success because without God, he has no place to take his failure. I think leaders do the most damage. I know that I've done the most damage when I've tried to conceal my weakness or my need instead of holding it up to God or holding it out to friends and my spiritual director and others who can assist me in supplying for that lack and that need that is within me. Not simply my sin, but also my weakness and my need. God, I always tell our students that God has given us all the talents and the gifts that we need to serve him in the unique mission we have, but he hasn't given us much extra. and that's so that we can count on him. And that's why envy is so stupid, gazing at others' gifts and wishing that we had them. That doesn't make any sense because the Lord has provided for us. And so I think a word of encouragement to leaders would be to say that we shouldn't conceal anything, because if we do, that is how we harm those who are under our care. And ourselves too, rather to hold everything up to God in confidence and then to find fellow pilgrims who are serving the Lord and who themselves need encouragement and accompaniment, and to find them and to know that they're part of our lives and a mutual support. All of that's really important. Now, I say that because I need to hear it again right now as we're having this conversation. I need to be reminded of it because I fail in that respect all the time. But I do remember, Brett, I will say this, in the early days, so I was inaugurated in 2009 at the age of 34.
The youngest president at the time, right?
Yeah, and I was very inexperienced and unqualified for my job in every possible way. But in the middle of the night, when I was feeling overwhelmed, I had to make a choice that everybody has to make between self-pity and surrender. And in my best moments, I held my whole self up to God. And here's what I said: I didn't get myself into this. Lord, you got me into this. Here I am. I said yes after having said no. But I said yes ultimately. And so here I am. I'm in this seat. I have this responsibility. I'm not up to it. And you know that. And so it's not just my responsibility, it's yours too. And this is a great relief for leaders, Brett, that we're only co-responsible for our lives. We're not simply responsible. God's responsible too. And he's happy to be responsible with us for our lives, for the effect of what we do, the outcomes of our lives, and for our ultimate destiny, which is union with him forever.
Amen. I find it interesting when leaders have as a strategy, maybe not articulated, but in operation, it happens that we conceal our weaknesses and our faults and our mistakes because we fear disclosing them will somehow take us off the mantle of this leadership position that we put in. But everybody usually already knows. You're not telling them anything they don't know. Yeah. You're just admitting it and then modeling. I think that mistakes are okay around here. Failure is okay around here because it's part of our human experience, and modeling what to do with it. I go to a Father who loves me and he forgives me and restores me. So thank you for that.
Sure.
Thank you for that. And thank you for your time. Unfortunately, it's up. I wish we had, a scotch between us and really go for another couple hours. That would be very preferred. But I really just want to thank you, Monsignor, for taking the time today, but also for just saying yes. Yes to your call, yes to all the ways that you're leading and giving wisdom and light to the world. It has been an absolute gift for me personally, for my family, for everybody here in Vancouver. So thank you so very much.
Oh, God bless you, Brett. Thanks for all the work that you do and for your leadership, especially in the ways that you accompany those who are in the apostolic field and give them that ray of encouragement which shines so brightly from you. So God bless you in your work.
Amen.
And pray for the University of Mary. Pray for all that we're doing out here.
I will. It's not close from my hometown. Not far from my hometown, I should say. Blessings. Thanks so much. Till next time.